So in this video, we will be talking about biogeochemical cycle disruptions. So biogeochemical cycles are also known as nutrient cycles. This includes the carbon cycle, the oxygen cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So nutrient cycles can be disrupted by human activities. So disruptions to these cycles caused by humans can happen in a number of ways. So we're going to talk about some of those ways, but just a little bit of an idea of what's going on. So if you picture this happy juggling man over here, and he's happy and juggling, and then, so what would happen if we threw in 4 more balls, for example? Would he be able to catch them and continue juggling? Or would they all fall? And so in this video, we're going to talk about the ecosystem as the juggler. So first we're going to talk about eutrophication, which is caused by excess phosphorus and nitrogen in an environment. So this is primarily caused by runoff from farms, either from fertilizer application, either man-made fertilizer, which you can see here being applied, or manure, or just livestock runoff in general, which you can see here, and also over here. So say there was a big heavy rain, the excess fertilizer would run off into the nearby ditch, and then it would find its way into some sort of body of water. Same with over here, run off and fall into some sort of body of water. So eutrophication is the excessive richness of nutrients in a lake or other body of water, frequently due to runoff from the land, which causes a dense growth of plant life and death of animal life from a lack of oxygen. So this is caused by cyanobacteria, and so here we have a picture of some blue-green algae, which grew as a result of excessive nutrients in the water. So talking about this a little bit more, so if have green. So let's say we have that farm runoff from the last slide, and it runs into this body of water. And then, so those excess nutrients are able to be utilized by the cyanobacteria, and then it grows on the surface of the water. And then the sunlight above can't get through. So that's not happening. So nowhere under here is getting light because the cyanobacteria is absorbing all of the light. So then down here, so these plants down here, they aren't getting any light. So then they begin to die. And since there's no plant life down here, that means that there's no oxygen production happening. So there's no oxygen. So there's not enough oxygen, then the fish are going to die too. So you're left with a yucky body of water covered in algae, much like in this photo, which is of Lake Winnipeg, which was a big problem in Lake Winnipeg, particularly in the 90s. But because of invasive species, the water's actually becoming a little bit clearer. But we'll talk about that when we talk about invasive species and zebra mussels. So we talked about this being caused by farm runoff, but this can also happen naturally. It doesn't happen quite as often. Typically we see this as a result of agricultural practices. But so this photo is taken at Fort White Alive, and so you can see this is during geese migration in the fall. So there are all of these birds, and they're all landing on the lake. So they're all pooping, obviously. So that goes into the water. That also creates an excess of nutrients. So to combat the algal growth at Fort White Alive, what they decided to do was they installed an aeration system in the lake. So it pumps oxygen in so that the aerobic species can still breathe and have access to oxygen, like the fish. So that solution obviously wouldn't be viable somewhere like Lake Winnipeg. So what can we do to combat eutrophication? So practicing good agricultural practices is our best solution. So incorporating legumes into your crop rotation, so things like soybeans and peas, we kind of talked about yesterday. I apologize that the explanation of the nitrogen cycle wasn't super clear. If you have any questions about that, you can ask me. But anyways, so by incorporating soybeans or peas or alfalfa into your crop rotation, you decrease the need for fertilizer because you're getting those nutrients from the bacteria that grows in the roots of the plant. So also following regulations. So for example, in Manitoba, it is illegal to put manure on your fields between November and April. That way, when spring flooding comes around, the manure isn't running off into the ditches and then into the lake. And also just proper general containment of livestock manure. So kind of a fun fact, you may notice if you see a fountain that the water is dyed blue. And so that is to prevent algal growth because the algae is blue and cannot absorb blue light. So since the water's blue, as soon as the sunlight hits the water, it's also blue. So then the algae can't grow. So that's kind of cool. So now we're going to talk about carbon. So carbon sinks. So a carbon sink is any natural reservoir that absorbs more carbon than it releases and thereby lowers the concentration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So Earth's biggest carbon sink is the ocean by far, but it also includes forests and grasslands and other places with vegetation because plants store and process carbon dioxide into oxygen. So the enhanced greenhouse effect. So burning fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and scientists hypothesize that the cause of the increase in Earth's average surface temperatures that contributes to global climate change. So you can see over here, there's a bit of a chart. I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar with climate change. It's kind of a big topic these days. But as you can see, starting in 1880, around the Industrial Revolution, we have slowly but surely climbed in temperature. So there are other contributors to the enhanced greenhouse effect, including deforestation. So by cutting down a forest, we no longer have that as a source, as a carbon sink. And also livestock. So if you think 100 years ago, there were a lot of small farmers, but they may have only farmed like a certain amount of cows. Well, today there are over 1 billion cows on Earth. And these cows obviously all have to release gas, and that gas that comes out of cows is methane, which also contributes to the greenhouse effect. So what does this effect have on land? So the overall increase in global temperature leads to an increase in the growing season. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. For example, in Manitoba, because the temperatures have been going up and we have more warm days in the summer, we're actually able to grow more varieties of crops. So things like corn and soybeans, they weren't realistically possible to grow like 50 years ago as a field crop. Uh, Other effects include the introduction of new pests or diseases. So, for example, ticks, as our summers have gotten warmer and it's less cold, you can see here. So, here is the range of ticks in 1971 to 2000. And then there's a projection 2011 to 2040, and then 2041 to 2070. And so we've seen this, for example, with the introduction of the Lone Star tick in Manitoba, and also tick season has gotten a little bit longer too. And there's also a higher frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, like flooding, for example. So there are also effects on marine life. So the ocean absorbs 93% of the heat energy released from burning fossil fuels. And so as a result, the ocean is slowly getting warmer, bit by bit by bit. And so if you look over here, we have this lovely stony coral on the left side, and then it is totally decimated on the right side. So the lovely color in the coral is actually produced by a tiny algal species that lives and it grows and acts like a skin on top of the bony coral shell underneath. And so that produces the bright colors. It provides nutrients to the coral, and it also provides food for the fish that live in coral reefs. And so it's very, very, very sensitive to temperature change. In fact, anything over 31 degrees Celsius, and the algae dies. And then that's how we end up with coral bleaching. And so the coral basically dies, and we're left with just the skeleton. All the fish either die off or move on. They have no food to eat, and overall, not good. So because the ocean is a carbon sink, there's also a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the ocean. And so this reduces the pH of seawater. So seawater becomes more acidic. And so this reduces shell growth in species with calcium carbonate shells. So shells like this. So here are just some more photos. So this one depicts coral bleaching. You can see over here. We can't see any fish species. And over here is a nice, vibrant, living coral reef. And so over here is just some more effects of ocean acidification. You can see here that the water has actually basically dissolved this shell. So what can we do to reduce carbon emissions? So for starters, we can conserve boreal forests. Canada has over 1 billion acres of boreal forest, and it is the single largest terrestrial carbon sink on the planet, which is pretty cool. We can also recycle more. Recycling reduces the amount of pollution that gets released into the air, because typically it is less resource intensive to reuse something than to make something new. So think like bottles and cans and things that are easily recyclable. And so finally, the daily questions. So in your own words, what is eutrophication? Why can it be harmful to an aquatic ecosystem? And what are 3 ways to reduce your impact on the carbon cycle, besides the ones that we talked about?